Now. We're going to begin chapter 14 if you want to follow along. And we're going to begin studying the third branch of government, the federal court system, the judiciary. That's very, very relevant since we just had a new Supreme Court justice confirmed. What's today? The 4th, so 9 days ago on Monday, October 26th. Amy Coney Barrett replaced the notorious RGB, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So once again, we have 9 justices on the Supreme Court. So I'm going to present the material that's in the book, but it won't be in the same order. And I'm going to have a lot of supplemental stuff to be illustrative or illustrative of what we're talking about. This is how the federal court system works. You can also think of it in a tri-scheme setup. Just as there's 3 branches of federal government, we can look at the federal court system in a 3-branch scheme. The Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, is the highest court in our nation. Their building is in Washington, D.C. There are 9 Supreme Court justices. And if someone goes to court in their county and they lose, and then they take it to the state court and they lose, and then they take it to a district court and they lose, and then a circuit court of appeals and they lose, the last option they have is the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land. But there's a good chance that their case is not going to be heard by the Supreme Court, and I'll tell you why here in a little bit. Then you have the U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. This is made up of 12 courts that cover 12 regions in the United States. Then you have U.S. District Courts, which I believe there's 94 of them. Here is another way to look at this system. Here you see it 3 branches side by side. Here is a tier. The Supreme Court at the top, 12 Circuit Court of Appeals, or appellate courts. We'll talk about what appellate means. You can see they have 12, they're 12 regional courts. And then there's 1 U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. Then those district courts, which I mentioned, there's 94 of them. These are trial courts. You have 94 judicial districts along with a U.S. bankruptcy courts. You have a U.S. Court of International Trade, and you have a U.S. Court of Federal Claims. Trial courts are where something comes to trial. Pretty basic. Appellate courts are where something from a lower court is being appealed. You can see the relation of appellate to the word appeal. Something from a lower court, someone in a case did not like the outcome, and so they appeal to a higher court. Then you have some other federal courts that are outside of the judicial branch. Military courts. Military courts are on a federal level because the military is a federal agency, or is a arm of the federal agency. But the courts for military personnel are not a part of the judiciary. Then you can see a U.S. tax court and some other judicial bodies that are federal but not within the third branch of the judicial branch. Here's kind of the flow chart of how these things work. If you go to the Supreme Court and they hear your case and they do not overturn the lower courts, then you live with the outcome. The Supreme Court of the United States is the last option that you have to get your case won. But cases that involve state laws or local laws have this chain of going to a state trial court. If you lose and you don't like the outcome, you then go to a state appeal court. And if they rule against you, then you can go to the state Supreme Court. In our state, you would then, you would take it to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. Now, there is something missing here. Oh, no, they're not, sorry. Then if you lose here, you could appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. What I thought was mistaken was this U.S. Court of Appeals should have been here, but that's not true. Only cases that involve federal laws would go to the U.S. Court of Appeals. Start out in the district courts, then go to the U.S. Court of Appeals. That's those 12 regional courts. And then if you didn't get a ruling that you wanted, then you go to the Supreme Court. Cases that involve a foreign diplomat or state government automatically start in the Supreme Court. Any questions so far? So you'll want to know the makeup of the judicial branch for the test, and this slide along with this one is the best way to remember that. In a 3-branch system, or in a pyramid of 3 levels, the Supreme Court, only one of those at the very top, 12 circuit courts of appeals, 94 plus a few other district courts. Any questions? Is it good to drink a Java? Now, you guys might not have heard the rhetoric the last 10, 15 years that many conservatives will bring up, but you might have heard this, that they believe that the Supreme Court is becoming an activist court. That is, the Supreme Court, instead of examining a case and deciding whether or not it's constitutional or not, the Supreme Court is acting as though they are the ultimate deciders of what is constitutional or not. Let me give you an example. In 2013, well, let me go back a little bit before that. I believe around 1998, many states put in their bylaws of their constitution that a marriage is defined as the union of one man and one woman. And then I think the United States Congress had a Defense of Marriage Act, which basically said the same thing. Now, if I remember correctly, I'm not sure about Oklahoma, but in some of the states, it was decided by a vote of the people. In other words, they put it on the ballot of an election and let the people decide. So from the late 1990s and the turn of the millennium, many states, if not all of them, had adopted the Defense of Marriage definition, or they had put something in their bylaws that marriage is defined as one man and one woman. And again, some of the states, it was something that the people did in their election. If I remember correctly, Oklahoma did have something like that. Well, in 2013, our state Supreme Court, that is, let me show you a picture of them. Now, this is our current Supreme Court, so not all 9 of these people were on the court in 2013. And the Chief Justice of our Supreme Court is this woman right here in the middle, Noma Gurich. But in 2013, our Oklahoma Supreme Court made same-sex marriage a legal right in Oklahoma. Basically, and effectively struck down Oklahoma's bylaw that marriage is defined as a union between a man and a woman. When that happened, the talk about, oh, this court is acting like an activist court. 9 people, and actually I think the vote was 7-2. So 7 judges basically overruled either what Congress in Oklahoma had decided or what the people had decided. I can't remember if we voted on it in Oklahoma. But anyway, that's what they mean when they talk about activism on the Supreme Court. Because when a state or a nation votes, when the citizens vote and an overwhelming majority says this is what we want. When a small body of people that consists of 9 judges overrules it, many people look at that as being activist. They're going outside of their bounds. So that leads us to the question, what are the limits on the Supreme Court's power? Are there limits to the Supreme Court's power? Yes. And actually, we should probably think of these as constraints. The court can rule a law unconstitutional, or they can say it's constitutional, but the executive branch, that is the presidency, or the state government, or the local officials, have to enforce the court's decisions. So the Supreme Court let's continue with using the state Supreme Court. The decision in 2013 to legalize same-sex marriage in Oklahoma. Well, what if the county clerk in Lafleur County at the Poto Courthouse did not want to issue marriage licenses to same-sex couples? That would be putting a constraint or a limit on the court's power. Now, it would probably just be for a short period of time, but usually the state or local officials usually enforce the Supreme Court's decisions. Another way that their power can be limited is that Congress could decide to pass a new law. You know, get around the law that the court said was constitutional by passing a whole new law. Or if the court said that a law was unconstitutional, Congress can change that law or amend the Constitution. That's what the legislative branch does. They make the laws. The executive branch, the president, makes sure they're enforced, and the courts make sure, if they are ever challenged, that they're constitutional or unconstitutional. Now, we know that the president can appoint justices because President Trump just appointed Amy Coney Barrett, and Congress has to approve them, which they did with her. It was a vote of 52 to 48. But what you might not have known is that Congress, just as they can impeach the president, they have the power to impeach and remove justices. And that serves as a check or a constraint to judicial power. And then one more constraint. You can see here that the Supreme Court cannot make a decision about a law where they would say it's unconstitutional unless it is a law that is being appealed because in a lower court, the law was ruled unconstitutional. Let me try to make that a little bit clearer. Only if a law has been challenged in a lower court can the Supreme Court then decide on that law. But that case also has to come to the Supreme Court on appeal. That law also has to be a case that involves a federal question. So let me stick with the same-sex issue. Our state Supreme Court made it legal in 2013. Then 2 years later, the US Supreme Court on June 25th, 2015, made it a federal right. And therefore, once the Supreme Court made it constitutional, every state had to recognize same-sex marriages. Even if the state had their own law by their own Supreme Court that it was unconstitutional, federal law, remember, trumps federal law overrules state law. Federal decisions will supersede state ones. So, where was I going with that? Remember, your instructor is in his 40s, so he has lapses of memory. Actually, I'm in the last year of my 40s. I'm almost 50. Goodness gracious me. All right. So, okay, the Supreme Court, in dealing with the same-sex marriage issue, that involves a federal question. That involved a federal question. The Supreme Court will usually stay out of things that are highly political, that is highly controversial. And then notice this biggie right here. The Supreme Court never considers guilt or innocence. Right? They don't have a case where someone comes up and there's a defense attorney and a prosecutor. They just hear basically appeals. Appeals of lower courts' decisions. And they just determine if something is constitutional or not. So on page on page 419, the first paragraph says, quote, "The Supreme Court seldom accepts a routine case. Even if the justices believe that a lower court made a mistake, the court's job is not to correct the errors of other courts, but to resolve substantial legal issues. The court's own guidelines say that there must be compelling reasons for accepting a case. Such reasons would include trying to resolve an issue that is being decided inconsistently by the lower courts. So let's say you had a county court make one ruling and someone then appealed to the state district court and they had a different ruling, and then it went to the state Supreme Court and they went back to the county's ruling. And so there's all this inconsistency in the lower courts. That might be a compelling reason for the Supreme Court to hear it. When the court, that is when the Supreme Court does accept a case, the chances are high that most of the justices disagree with the lower court's rulings. About 3/4 of Supreme Court decisions reverse the decisions of the lower courts. So there are some limits or some constraints on the Supreme Court's power. Any questions? Next, we're going to talk about jurisdiction. Jurisdiction refers to the authority that a court has to hear cases. And there are a couple of types of jurisdiction. There's original jurisdiction right here, which means that this kind of a court that has original jurisdiction is the court that will hear a case for the first time. So let's say two families who live on, I'm gonna use Arkoma as an example. Two families that live on the outskirts of Arkoma, and they have land that borders each other. And one fella, he thinks his land is actually, let's just say it's on one border of the land. There are some oak trees, and they were planted, and they're in a good straight line. They were planted years ago to be a wind block. And one guy says, my grandpa planted those, and so that's my property. But the other guy says, no, my deed of land says they were actually planted on my property. And so they go to court over it. Which court would have jurisdiction over that? It would be probably, I don't know that, since it's on the outskirts of Arkoma, it probably wouldn't go to the city court in Arkoma. So it would probably go to Poteau, to the county court. The county court would have jurisdiction, original jurisdiction, to hear that case for the first time. Another type of jurisdiction is appellate. And this is the right to hear a case that is being appealed. So let's say, let's call the guy who had the oak tree Citizen Johnson. Let's say that Poteau sided with, let's say the county court sided with the other citizen, Citizen Miller. Citizen Johnson then appeals to, since he lost in county court, he then appeals to the state Supreme Court. That's the kind of jurisdiction, though, that we're talking about now. Not original, but appellate. The state Supreme Court has the right to hear a case on appeal and see if the law was applied correctly or if it was unfair in the Poteau courthouse. These are the two jurisdictions that are highlighted in your textbook on page 418, so you'll want to know those. But a couple of other types of jurisdiction are exclusive jurisdiction. These are the types of cases that the Constitution assigns only to federal courts. So it would include cases that involve national laws. The federal government, as well as other governments, such as state governments or foreign governments. Then you have concurrent jurisdiction, which are cases that can be decided in state or federal courts. And then, of course, there's three levels of jurisdiction: federal, state, and local. Those are the three levels of jurisdiction. You want to know those, and you want to know these two types of jurisdiction: original and appellate. This slide shows you all of the courts in Oklahoma. Of course, the Supreme Court with 9 judges, just like the U.S. Supreme Court. We have an Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals with 5 judges. We have Oklahoma Court of Civil Appeals. We have an Oklahoma Trial Court, Oklahoma District Courts, 73 district judges, 77 associate district judges, 87 special judges. And then we have a workers' comp court in Oklahoma. If you are aspiring to go into law and eventually want to be a judge, there are more positions to be a judge than you think. What are the differences between state courts and federal courts? State courts get the day-to-day cases, which are about 90% of all cases. Day-to-day. Disputes between neighbors, maybe a dispute between a city and one of its citizens. They hear both civil and criminal matters. And we would say that criminal law is something like shoplifting or murder. That's criminal. A civil issue would be like a divorce between two people or a dispute between businesses. There's information on that on page 423. And what the state courts do is it helps each state maintain their own sovereignty in, judicial matters that deal with laws in the state that are not laws that are a part of the national government. See, I was just talking about a law about something if it was illegal in Oklahoma. But we can use the election for something like this as an example. For example, there are still some states that will be counting ballots. Some people say through Friday. Some states, I think each state has their own law about, you know, their own laws dealing with the matters of ballots and elections and how that works, what time the election polling places open and what time they close, when you can receive or when you can still mail in your ballot. These are state laws that are distinct from the national government. That's why you hear some people saying President Trump and his people, they can't get the counting of ballots closed in all states, because some states have allowed in their state laws for ballots to be counted until everyone is counted. Now, federal courts, again, they involve hearing federal questions which involve the Constitution or a federal treaty or a federal party in which the U.S. government is a party to the case, like U.S. government versus the U.S. government versus the Immigration Commission or something like that. Federal party, and it involves the U.S. government as a party in the case. Federal laws. They also hear both civil and criminal matters, although criminal cases involving federal law are usually tried in state courts. And then, of course, they hear cases that involve interstate matters. Maybe a dispute between like Arkansas and Oklahoma. Diversity of citizenship, which would involve parties of two different states, or between a U.S. citizen and a citizen of another nation. So any questions on the jurisdiction of our courts and what kind of cases the state courts hear versus federal courts? This here is a picture of I think the east side of the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. And there is, if you see the whole picture, there are many images made out of this marble of different people on both sides. And they are basically engravings of great lawgivers from past society. I think you have Confucius from China. I think you have maybe like Socrates from the Greek society. And right in the very middle is Moses holding the Ten Commandments. So, but all these lawgivers are on that east side of the building to represent that this is a place where the law is upheld. Anyway, any questions? We're going to stop there and we'll pick up on Friday with our Oklahoma Supreme Court and move to the U.S. Supreme Court. This is our Supreme Court in Oklahoma City. Okay, so be looking for Module 4. I will first post the general page and then the assignments after that. If there's no questions, then